Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Today we're going to talk about what your rights are as the passenger in a vehicle that gets pulled over by the police. Not too long ago, I did a video about what happens at the roadside and what your rights are when you get pulled over as the driver of a vehicle. And that led a lot of people to the obvious next question. What happens if you are the passenger in that car? Do you have the same rights? Do you have different rights? Do you have expanded rights? So we're going to discuss that today. In case you're curious, a lot of this stems from the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which says you have the right to be secure in your person and so on against unreasonable searches and seizures, against unreasonable searches and seizures. And I have to point out as an attorney that the word unreasonable is in there for a reason. That means that the police can occasionally do a search or seizure that's considered reasonable. That's not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Don't argue with me about that. It's true. So here's what we're talking about. You're driving along and you're the passenger in a vehicle. You could be in the passenger seat. You could be in the back seat if there is one. And the police pull over the vehicle you're in, but you are not the driver. The first thing you have to remember is that, yes, you have now been seized, okay? And this is true of the driver as well. You are both now subject to a seizure. You are both at the side of the road. The police have detained you temporarily for whatever reason, okay? The first thing you need to know is that as the passenger, you have every right to challenge that stop just as much as the driver does. So let's suppose something happens during this stop that is unlawful, or you believe it's unlawful. Even if the driver decides not to fight it, you can, okay, if in fact there's some reason for you to do so. Like, so in other words, you get pulled over by the side of the road, you're the passenger in the vehicle, and somehow you wind up getting arrested, but your driver doesn't. Doesn't matter. You can still fight this because your rights are just as important, even though you're not behind the wheel of the vehicle. So you have the right to challenge the legality, but that's going to come later. So when they pull the car over, obviously they're pulling over everything in the car, including other people, including passengers. So your rights as a passenger, okay, are the same as the driver. So you have the right to be free from unreasonable or illegal searches, which I just told you about. You have the right to remain silent, okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. You have the right to challenge the legality of the stop in court, like I said, and the right to challenge the legality of any searches in court as well. Now, the right to remain silent is something that I think is much different for a passenger than it is for a driver. Because when a police officer pulls you over and you're driving, and the police officer walks up to your window and starts talking to you, we've all seen the videos on the internet where a driver literally just sits there and then says to the camera, "I'm not going to answer the questions because that would be a violation of my Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent." And and arguably you can take that position, but the question is really if a police officer walks up and says, "May I see your driver's license?" You handing the driver's license to the police officer is probably required by your state law, and that's really not interrogation for driver's license, okay? But here's the interesting thing. Let's say this traffic stop happens where you're in the passenger seat, driver's in the driver's seat. Two police officers walk up on both sides of the car, and the windows happen to be down. Police officer asks the driver, "May I see your driver's license?" Police officer on the passenger side says to you anything. "Who are you? May I see your driver's license?" You have the absolute right to just sit there. And I would argue and say that while I would suggest the driver may have some things to say to the police officer, you as a passenger are certainly within your rights to just look at the cop and just no, there's nothing to talk about, because as far as it just appears to be a random or a routine traffic stop, and the police officer stopped the vehicle because, if anything, of the way it's being driven, and you as a passenger have got nothing to do with the way it's being driven, and so there probably isn't any legitimate reason for them to speak to you unless they can identify, want to explain to you why they want to know something. So we'll get to that in a second. But, here's the thing. Police officers, and again, I know some people don't like me admitting this, but I think police officers do an important job in our society. And there are people out there who just view the police as the enemy. Like, it's just our job to mess with the police, make their job as hard as possible. If you want to do that and go through life that way, that's fine. But, when I interact with the police, I try to be polite as long as I think it's a reasonable interaction. Obviously, if a police officer kicked in my window right now and attacked me, that wouldn't be a reasonable thing. But if a police officer were to walk up to my door, knock on the door, and ask me a question that I made sense to me, I'd answer it. Okay, that's fine. I don't start from the position that the police are wrong. I start from the position that I'm going to watch how this unfolds and give the police officer the benefit of the doubt because he's got a job to do. And while people go, yeah, but he works for me. I'm his boss. Yes, he works for you and he's being paid to work for you to do a job. So let's assume the vehicle gets pulled over and the police officer is doing his job or her job, okay? You need to know, for instance, that if you're alone in a car and a police officer walks up to the car and is about to, ask you for your driver's license because you were speeding and then sees, a couple open beer cans like in the center console, which are obviously, or let's say beer bottles. You can actually see that it's open and half empty, and there's moisture on the outside indicating it's cold. Okay, so you have an open intoxicant in the car. Okay, now that's against the law in many states. Okay, I hope you know that. So if you're the driver and that's next to you, you're gonna get stuck with that. You can't say, oh, I picked up a hitchhiker a while back. He brought that in the car, and then he got out. He didn't take it with him. Oh my gosh, how'd they get there? Police aren't going to buy that, and you shouldn't be trying to sell it. But if you are the passenger in a car, okay, more often than not, the things in the car are still kind of tied to the driver. Now, it's true that if the police officers pull you over, and the driver is sitting there sober as a church mouse, and you're in the passenger seat, smoking crack and mainlining something that's not medicinal, there's a chance that the police officer could go, hey, something, I need to talk to that passenger about what he's doing right there, if in fact that's illegal. But generally speaking, things in the car are often kind of charged to the driver unless there's an obvious connection. But so for instance, let's suppose the police officers actually somehow open the trunk of the car up for whatever reason. The odds that you as the passenger are going to get in trouble for what's in the trunk of the car that's owned by the driver, it's probably not going to happen. But keep that in mind that, stuff that's underneath your seat, if it gets to that, somebody might go, gee, did you know that was under your seat? Don't answer that question, Fifth Amendment. But my point is, I'm simply raising the issues here. So passengers generally are not held to that standard with respect to things in the car. Now, remember that as a passenger, police officer walks up and starts talking to you. You can talk if you want to. I've made small talk with cops before in different settings. But, you don't have to. And as a passenger, I don't think you're doing anything wrong to just say, I don't feel like talking. I'm sorry. And leave it at that. However, here's the question. Suppose a police officer walked up the passenger side and said, something, we're about to breathalyze your driver. You want to blow a breathalyzer too? Here's the problem. If in fact the police pulled the car over because it was seen doing something that indicated it was being driven by a person who was intoxicated or otherwise illegally impaired, the fact that you're in the car, if you aren't the one driving, means that you couldn't have contributed to the reason that you were pulled over. So you have no reason under those facts to submit to anything. Keep in mind that in some states, you are not allowed to refuse breathalyzers or field sobriety tests or so on. And so if you are in a state where you have that law on the books, if you're the driver, absolutely. If they say, get out of the car right now, you're doing a field sobriety test, you have to make a decision, and you might break the law if you say no. But if you're the passenger and the police pulled you over because the car was doing this down the road and you were in the passenger or the back seat, and they say, we want to test you, absolutely not. Now, here's the thing. If you say no and they use some coercion to force you to do it, that's when you're going to wind up in court later and fight it and say, look, I didn't consent to that. I didn't agree to that, but they pressured me into it after I repeatedly said, I don't want to do this. I think this is wrong. One of the things I do have to point out, though, is how often people tell me that they understand the law, they don't like what happens at the roadside, and they sit there and they argue with the police about it. And that's one of the things that makes those videos so comical about the people at the side of the road who are arguing about things like driver's licenses or traveling versus driving and so on, is that they think that they can win a legal argument with a police officer. Well, the police officer is there to enforce the law and possibly hand you a ticket for an infraction. The place to argue that would be in a courtroom, okay? And so if any of this stuff happens to you as a passenger that's wrong, then you might wind up in a courtroom later fighting it. But if for no other reason than the car got pulled over because it was swerving down the road, if the police officer says, by the way, I want you to do a field sobriety test, at that point I'd say, no, I don't think I have to. I'm a passenger. I would decline that at this time. Now, here's the thing. As an attorney, I tend to think this way. And I've seen people on the internet who say there is never a circumstance where a passenger could be asked to blow a breathalyzer legally. There's never a circumstance. And I always say, well, let me give you a hypothetical. Because I can come up with hypotheticals, and I can beat almost anything you say is impossible. I'm joking, it's hyperbole. But let's suppose that you're driving down the road one day and you're swerving all over the place because you're drunk. Cop pulls you over, and you're pulled over the side of the road, and the cop leans over and looks and sees that sitting in the passenger seat is an 8-year-old boy. And he's wearing a seatbelt and properly and all that stuff. 8-year-old boy. And his eyes are doing this, and his eyes are glassy, and he reeks of alcohol because he's been drinking too. He's an 8-year-old kid. I think at that point, a police officer would be within his rights to say, I think we need to have the passenger blow a breathalyzer. Now, I understand right now there's probably somebody out there going, no, Steve, as a passenger, you can't make him do. Yeah. Cross that bridge when we get to it. But generally speaking, and I found this on a website that says, do you have a right to refuse alcohol or drug testing? The passenger's intoxication is irrelevant to an investigation where they're investigating the driver being impaired. So that makes sense. But like I said, there can be situations where it could happen. Highly unlikely, but it could be possible. Now, here's the thing I've had people say. They say, Steve, police pull the car over, I'm the passenger, and the cops are giving the driver a hard time, the driver's giving the cops a hard time or whatever, and I'm just sitting there, and I go, wait, I'm being detained. Am I free to go? If you want to, you can ask the police officer, say, excuse me, am I free to go? Now, here's the funny thing. The police officer might say, sure, knock yourself out, start walking. Because that's the problem. You're sitting in your ride. The car's not free to go because the driver and the car have been detained. And although you have been detained, if the police officer says, you know something, you're free to go. 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 In fact, we'd rather have you not be here. Go. Fewer witnesses. You can ask, am I free to go? But the question is, if the cop says, yeah, you're free to go, and you don't leave, what did you accomplish? I also have to point out that even on websites by attorneys who defend cases brought by citizens against the police, they will tell you that even if you hate the cops, even if you think that they are doing everything wrong, even if you think it's your job to fight with them at every turn, you still will get farther if you are at least polite and respectful. So if you get pulled over and you're the driver, I've already suggested you should be polite in an attempt to get the ticket reduced, the odds of being ticketed. But I think as a passenger, you should probably be polite also. If you want to, you can do the Fifth Amendment, just say it's my right. You could also be polite and just tell the officer, say, you know, it's my Fifth Amendment. Sorry, I'd just rather not talk to you. That's fine. But being polite goes a long way in our society. But keep in mind, you should never do anything that construed as interfering with the investigation. So let's suppose the cop walks up to the driver and says, may I see your driver's license and registration, please? And you lean over and put your hand on your friend's arm and say, don't give that to him. You don't have to do that. Now, you might be right that he doesn't have to do that or she doesn't have to do that. But is that your job at that point in time to be telling them how to interact with the police officer? Because there's a chance that a police officer might go, wait a second, I'm not talking to you in the passenger seat. I'm talking to the driver in the driver's seat. What are you even doing interfering with this? Is that interfering with the police officer's job? I'm not saying it is, okay? But the problem is, if it's perceived that way by the police officer, it's not going to make things go easier for either of you. Even if you think that you're being treated unfairly, okay? Let's suppose that you realize that the police officer's not looking, and you very quietly open your door somehow. Let's suppose the dome light's burned out. You open your door, and you take off running. And you go, I'm not being detained. Driver was pulled over. Cop never said a word to me. And you take off running, okay? I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, Steve, this is America. I've got the right to run anywhere I want. Whether I'm running from a receipt checker at Walmart or running from an unlawful stop at the side of the road. Yeah, you have the right to run. You've got the right to do that, I suppose. But of course, you're going to make a police officer think you're acting suspiciously. Again, is he right to think that? Is she right to think? I'm not saying they are. I'm just trying to give you advice here. And if you want to ignore it, feel free. But if you follow my advice, your life will actually go easier. And by the way, the same things I talk about making a traffic stop go well apply to a passenger. So let's suppose you get pulled over. You're the passenger, driver pulls the car over, and you say, quick, turn the dome light on, put your window down, put your hands on the wheel. This will go faster. And let's suppose your friend goes, oh, okay, and does all those things. That applies to you too. So if you're in the passenger seat, don't start digging in the glove box. Don't start digging around underneath the seat. Don't think that that's a good time to lean over in the back seat and start cleaning your weapon, which you legally have on you. Okay, somehow. Okay? The point is, that's not the time to do it. So you follow the same instructions as a passenger that you should as a driver. Are you legally required to? No. But I'm just saying to try to make these things go smoother. If you are in the passenger seat and a police officer asks you a question, if you don't want to answer him or her, I would suggest you ask, why are you asking me that? Am I under suspicion for anything? Because arguably there are situations where you could be. Let's suppose the police got a call that said there was a holdup at a gas station 5 miles back on the interstate, and it was in a car of a fairly common description, and there's 2 people in it, and we think they're both men. The police pull you over, and you're a man as a passenger in a car with another man, and you actually fit the description of these robbers. That's possible. So when you're sitting in the passenger seat and the police officer walks over and starts asking you questions, you can say, excuse me, sir, am I under suspicion of anything? And if he says no, and you say, okay, I'm sorry, I just don't want to make small talk, that's fine. But if he says, actually, yes, we're conducting an investigation, can I ask you some questions? At that point, if he's conducting an investigation, he has got the right to ask you questions. Now, you have the right to not answer those questions. But I've had people say, under no circumstances should you ever talk to him because they don't even have a right to do that. Well, they've got a right to do it. That's their job. It's whether you have a right to refuse to answer. And yes, you do have the right to refuse to answer. But if it's possible, you can very quickly give them the answers that will get you out of this situation because you can explain we didn't come from that way, we came from that way, and we can prove it somehow. You never know. You never know. Okay? So, again, you don't have to make small talk with them, and you can refuse to talk to them as the passenger, keep in mind. And then keep in mind, of course, the primary thing, and we've talked about this before, is that the length of time of the traffic stop is what's considered to be reasonable for the police officer to finish what he's doing, investigate what he needs to investigate, and then issue any citations, if any, and at that point, the stop ends. But there's no bright line. It's not 15 minutes, not 20 minutes, not 25 minutes. It's just what's reasonable, okay? And so if it starts getting past that point, you as the passenger could theoretically ask the police officer, again, I'm being detained here, and I don't understand why it's taking so long. You can ask that. You can always say again, am I being detained? And if the police officer says, no, you're not, then you can get out and start walking if you want to. Don't know how practical that might be, but that's the point. So as a passenger, you've got a lot more rights than you do as the driver of a vehicle pulled over. And I hope you understood those. Otherwise, questions or comments, fire them away. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.